And I'm going to welcome you to the 25th Annual Capital Conference. This is our virtual edition. It's our goal that each session is about an hour in length. However, we may go a little longer, it may be a little shorter. My name is David Stevens. I'm the Director of Academics. We are also assisted in this session by Glenda Munoz, UL Administrative Assistant. This session is for high school spelling, becoming legitimate Logophilic laureates, strategies for upping your game in your spelling game. It will be exciting and fun. We are very lucky to have Linda Berrey, who is our state contest director. She also writes all of the tests for district, region, and state. And she is also the voice you hear on that audio file or at that state meet, presenting those words. So she was reminding us this is the 8th year she's been doing this. It doesn't seem that long at all. So we're happy to have you, Linda, and thank you for being willing to share your wisdom and knowledge with our attendees at this version of our Capital Conference this year.
Welcome, everybody, to what I hope will be the final Zoom presentation I'll ever make. As David's already said, my name is Linda Berrey, and I have been the state contest director for the last 7 years, about to begin my 8th year. Before that, I coached this event at Waxahachie High School for 20 years. I was the spelling coach as well as one of the academic coordinators. And during that time, I picked up a few tricks of the trade that I hope I can pass on to you. This seminar is designed primarily for new coaches. For those of you seasoned coaches who have been to one of my Capital Conference presentations, you will note that some of the slides will not be new to you. However, a good deal of today's talk will focus on next year's words. So I do hope all of you will gain some good working information to help you kick off the next school year. It's my understanding that you all are muted right now and can't ask questions during this presentation. However, I do hope that you write down your questions and either pose them tomorrow during tomorrow's Q&A or send them to me in an email. So, logophiles out there, let's begin. Next slide, please. So, how did this whole idea, let's go back one slide, David. How did this whole concept of spelling come to be? Well, first of all, man is separated from all other animals by his ability to communicate across space and time. This ability is only made possible by written language. Communication in writing is made possible by man's agreement on the symbols that he uses. Next, this agreed sequence of those written symbols is called spelling. Next, I love this first slide. When our spelling is perfect, it's invisible, but when it's flawed, it prompts strong negative associations. As I said earlier, I was an English teacher for many years, and I always loved when I had a paper with invisible spelling and capitalization and grammar. You can bet that that paper got a good grade. However, if that said paper was peppered with misspelled words or grammatical errors, it did indeed prompt strong negative associations. Love this next quote. Spelling mistakes in a letter is like a bug on a white shirt. I love that image. I like this one too. If you can spell Nietzsche without Google or a dictionary, you deserve a cookie. Next. Even though a good speller has lost his ranking in some schools, we can hope there is one group of artisans who still find spelling important. the tattoo artist. Next. The police have no leads as yet on the person or persons who painted obscene suggestions on the buildings. One store owner said he was going to leave a dictionary on a public bench so the vandals could at least spell the obscenities correctly. Like this next one, I gave her a love letter and she returned it to me by correcting spelling and punctuation. As a little aside, I go back one slide, David. As a little aside, I did that to a menu one time. It was so full of misspelled words. I asked for a paper menu. I took my red pen out of my purse. I corrected all the spelling and handed it to the manager. Don't know if he appreciated it or not. Next. How about this one? You all have probably heard this. Mom asked, "Don't they teach you how to spell these days?" And the son says, "No, they teach us to use spell check." Next. You can't build up a vocabulary, which is an integral part of this test, if you never meet any new words. And to meet them, you've got to read. The more you read, the better. And I always encourage good spellers to read not just good books, but good literature. There is a difference. Next. To put it simply, spelling and vocabulary are both important. Correctly spelled words coupled with precise and compelling diction are two of the most important aspects of effective communication. And it's why the UIL Spelling and Vocabulary Contest is important in fostering confident use of words. Next. As you all may already know, the new list for 21-22 is now available online. All you have to do is go to uiltexas.org/academics. Locate the spelling tab and then scroll down till you see the new word list. You'll see it on the right-hand side of the page. Now, right now, I want to offer a bit of a disclaimer. I'm speaking to those of you who found this list several weeks ago and copied it. There has been found one error on this list, and the word is debakey. On the early list, on the original list, debakey had a space in between the DE and the bakey. That is incorrect. Debakey has no space at all. Next, let's talk about the contest itself. This contest is divided into three parts. Part one is subdivided into two areas, proofreading and vocabulary. Part two is spelling from dictation. This is the longest part of the test. And part three is the tiebreaker. Next, let's begin by talking about the part one proofreading section of the test. Next, this part is comprised of 15 word sets. Contestants will be given 15 sets of 5-word list, and you need to recognize the word that is misspelled in each list, then spell that word correctly. I want to stop here and say you get no points if on this part of the test you circle the incorrect word and you don't write the correct spelling in the given blank. So be sure you do that. Most of the words, although not all the words from this section of the test, are from word power. Up to 20% of the words on this section of the test can come from outside sources. Again, questions 1 through 15 of part 1 are comprised of 15 proofreading sets. Each question is worth 1 point. Next. Next. Now let's go to the second part of part 1, which is the vocabulary section. In my opinion, this is the easiest part of the test. The reason it's the easiest part of the test is because there are no misspelled words. There are no outside words. So you are responsible for taking a look at the 350 words that are designated by a dot on word power and study those words' origins as well as their meanings. You also need to be responsible for their spelling. So again, questions 16 through 30 are comprised of vocabulary entries and are each worth 1 point. Next. Now let's go to part 2. Part 2, as we said earlier, is the longest part of the test. It is comprised of 70 words pronounced at a rate of 4 words per minute. That means 1 word and definition every 15 seconds. A definition, while not all of the definitions, will be given for every word. Next. Now the tiebreaker is part 3. It's comprised of 20 words, pronounced again at 4 words per minute with definitions given for all words. Typically, the tiebreaker is not graded at district and regionals. The only time it's graded is in case of a tie, and then only those involved in the tie are scored. At the state meet, however, we choose to grade all of the tiebreakers because typically we have lots of ties at state. Next. Now let's talk about the source of words. A minimum of 80% of the test words for questions 1 through 15 of part 1, as well as parts 2 and parts 3, come from the word power list that you already have access to. Up to 20% can come from different sources. They can come from common usage. They might come from words you might find in one of your textbooks. They can also come from the news and things that are current events. They can also come from vocabulary builders. Next. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten emails from students over the years asking me where they go to study for the outside words. Well, here's your answer. How do you prepare? You pay attention and you know all the roots, prefixes, and affixes. You read widely. Again, you read good literature, not necessarily good books, and pay attention to any new words that you find. Another way you can find outside words is go to the internet and find lists for SAT or college vocabulary. There is a site called Quizlet.com that has a list of College Board top 100 SAT, ACT vocabulary words. Another site to go to is majortest.com. And many of you have already discovered this site. It's a site of 5,000 words, and it can be found at freevocabulary.com. I have found that some of the vocabulary tests on Facebook can be challenging. I would also suggest your spellers sign up for Word of the Day with dictionary.com. How do I find these outside words? Well, like students do, I pay attention. During the earlier days of the pandemic, I listened to a new word I hadn't heard of. It was called hydroxychloroquine, and it was one of the treatments, the early treatments for COVID-19. I could not find it in the dictionary, Therefore, it would never be an eligible word on the test. A recent outside word was human papillomavirus. I spotted that at the pharmacy at Walmart while I was waiting to pick up a prescription. Another one I saw in the newspaper, I heard about on television, was the town Punxsutawney. I heard that word prior to Groundhog Day in February. It's in the dictionary, so it made its way onto the test. In the spring, when I was shopping for flowers, I spotted the word impatience. Like that word, it's in the dictionary, therefore it's made its way onto a recent state test. Again, when you spot words you've never seen before, check the dictionary and check only our required dictionary to see if it's there. And if it's there, it's eligible. If it's not there, it is not eligible. Next slide. The only official dictionary for this contest is this one. Pay attention to this. It's the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, 5th edition, 50th anniversary printing. It's got to be the 2018 edition. Make sure you know there is a difference between the 5th edition and the 5th edition 50th anniversary printing. It's the newest dictionary, and it is the sole source for all the words for this contest. Be sure you know that neither the paperback version or any online dictionary would be acceptable as a source for this contest. Did you know that the winning word a few years ago for the script spelling bee was a word called koinonia, which means Christian fellowship? I like that word. I saw it in print. I'm thinking that could be a great outside word. I looked for it in this particular dictionary. It was not there. Therefore, it will never show up on a UIL test. Next slide. If we happen to spot another error on the word power list, it's highly unlikely, but should that happen, look at the spelling web page on the UIL website and you can see it listed for you right there. Next slide. Now, let's begin talking about some strategies to make your students better spellers. We're going to talk about phonics and pronunciation in particular. Next slide. We're going to talk about the importance of sounding out words. We're going to talk about sound symbol correspondence and coloring sounds. That may be something new to you. Next slide. How do you spell a really long word? Coaches, I would imagine you all use this tip. You spell a really long word by first sounding it out. It worked for us as elementary students, and it still works today. Next slide. How many of you all remember this word from Mary Poppins? As an aside, it is not in the dictionary. It will never be on a UIL test, but look at the length of that word. How do you tackle spelling it? You divide it into chunks, not necessarily syllables, but chunks that are easier to spell. And you can see it divided. It's not as hard to spell. You've got super, and then cowley, and then fragile, istic, expi, alley, do, shus. It makes it easier when you break it into pieces. But for now, let's practice with a new list word that isn't quite as long. The word is epiphenomenalism. Next slide. We divide that long word into chunks. You would start with the first syllable, in this case, and then p, then thin, then and then an, and ow, and ism. And it's easier to tackle. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about pronunciation. In the history of the world, spelling is a very recent language skill, occurring only in the last millennium, really. Before there was a written form of language, there were words, oral words. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century made it necessary to come to an agreement on how to present words in writing. Next slide. In languages like Latin and Spanish, there's a direct correspondence between sound and symbol. Each sound is represented by a specific symbol. In languages including English, however, a speech sound may be represented by several symbols, and a symbol may represent several sounds depending on the letters around it. Next slide. Those of you veterans out there will recognize this slide, but it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. Those of you new coaches out there, how do you think you would pronounce that word? You may think, well, I've never seen that word before. Next slide. That word is actually pronounced fish. How is that possible? Well, if you look at the last two letters of the word cough, that GH make F sound. You look at the word women, that O makes the short I sound. And if you look at the word nation, that TI ends up making the SH sound. This is English, and this is also why the English language is one of the hardest languages on earth to learn. Next slide. Look at this word. You all are familiar with this word. What do you notice about all three vowels you see there? You would notice that they're all three the same. Next slide. They may all three be the same, but all three of them are pronounced differently. For instance, that first E is pronounced That second E in the syllable said is pronounced with a long A. The third syllable E's is pronounced with a long E. Next slide. And here's a fun one attributed to Oscar Wilde. If GH can stand for P as in hiccup, if OUGH stands for O as in dough, if PHTH stands for T as in Tisus, if EIGH stands for A as in neighbor, if TTE stands for T as in gazette, and EAU stands for O as in plateau, the right way to spell potato should be, next slide. Isn't that crazy? This is why English is so hard to learn. Next slide. Another thing that makes this language hard to learn is the pervasive schwa we see in words. This is the most common sound in the English language, and it is represented in the dictionary by an upside down E, and it makes the sound. The schwa falls only on unstressed syllables. Any vowel can make the sound, and even the Y can make the sound. Sometimes the schwa can even show up where vowels don't go, as in the word rhythm. You've got that sound, that schwa, in between the H and the M. Next slide. And only in the English language can one little sound be so versatile. It's why there are no spelling contests in other languages. In Romance languages like French and Spanish, vowels are predictable. Take, for example, the word banana. In Spanish, those three A sounds are identical, as in banana. But in English, because the stress falls on the middle syllable, the first and the third sounds become schwas, as in banana. Next slide. And as you know, since English absorbs words from every language, words with obvious spellings in their native tongues can become mysterious to us. Next slide. Do you remember our word, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? Look at how many schwas there are in that word. The first sound, if you see, is spelled with an E. The second sound is spelled with an I. The third is spelled with an I. The fourth is spelled with an I. And that last sound that's dropped down a bit is spelled with the triphthong IOU. All of them different spellings. Next slide. You will see that the schwa is pervasive in virtually every word. Every word I would almost say except single syllable words. But look at how often you see the schwa in some of these words. Look at the word adenoma. It's got two schwas. That first schwa is spelled with an E. That second schwa is spelled with an A. Then look at indecipherable. You see three different schwas in that word, three different us in that word. That first one is spelled, the first schwa is spelled with an E. The second schwa is spelled with an A. And that third schwa comes in between the B and the L. Next slide. Let's talk about consonant blends. They have those words, those letters, when they are written together, have different sounds when they're said together as opposed to pronounced separately. Sometimes separating these pairs into their component sounds, exaggerating the sound, facilitates spelling. So this is a little strategy you might use with some of your students. That strategy is in the next slide. We're going to talk about coloring sounds. Sound or consonant sound blends can sometimes be troublesome. They may sound the same, but they have different spellings. Like these two words right here, precious and contentious, have they end in the same sound, but they're spelled differently. The way to teach your brain what the first letter of that shus sound is to what is called speak the spelling. Next slide. Let's practice with a new list word. The word is amentation. If you were teaching your students to color it, again, coloring it out loud, this is what it would look like. They would say, see us. What that's doing when you're pronouncing the word out loud is you are telling your brain that the first letter of that shus suffix begins with a C. Next slide. Next slide. What about the word scrumptious? That's a new list word as well. How would you color that word? Next slide. You would color it like this, scrumptious. Again, by saying this word out loud, you're telling your brain the first letter to that shus sound is the T. Next slide. Let's talk about some of the spelling items your students are going to have to contend with. We're going to have to talk about compound words. And I think compound words are particularly troubling because when you hear them, you've got three choices in how to spell them. They can either be possibly written as one word, they can be written as two words, they can be hyphenated. You have to be aware of how they're spelled. You also have to contend with words with non-alphabetical marks like apostrophes and hyphens. You've got words you're going to deal with that have alternate spellings. You got capitalization, words that have to be capitalized. Words that have optional capitalization. Words where the definition will inform whether or not it has to be capitalized. You've also got words that have capital letters in the middle of words. And you have words that have both capitalization, uppercase, and lowercase entries. Next slide rather. Let's look at some of our new words. Here's a little sampling of 2- and 3-word test items. Breeches buoy is one. Fact-finding is one. Ipsissima verba, latchkey child, slice of life. You would, as your contestants, they would have to know how to spell those correctly. Your students would need to know that, for instance, latchkey is written as one word, but then there is a space between latchkey and child. You also need to be aware of some of those non-alphabetic elements. For instance, Alençon features a cedilla underneath the C. Ancien regime has an aigu over the I. Averroes features an umlaut over the E. Bêtise has a circumflex over the E. Pinata has the tilde. And then déjà vu has 2 accents. It's got both the aigu accent as well as the grave accent. All of those non-alphabetical elements are just as important to spelling a word correctly as the letters themselves. Next slide. Now let's look at a smattering of alternate spellings on this year's list. You've got the word kafia. It can be spelled either way. Either spelling would be acceptable. The same is true with Pangea, with re-educate, with clubbable. I will say, I think that second way to spell clubbable just looks wrong, but it's acceptable. So it would certainly be counted right. The word trudgeon and then yogurt. Again, a lot of students are kind of taken aback by that third spelling of yogurt because you never see that spelled like that. We believe that all the alternate spellings are disclosed in our word power. However, the ultimate source is our American Heritage Dictionary, that 50th anniversary printing. Next slide. Let's talk about words that hinge on being capitalized. You've got a whole list of words that have to be capitalized. For example, you've got Sakharov, you've got Celotex, you've got Beirut and Wagnerian, probably Wagnerian. You've got where capitalization is optional. That means if these were spelling words, you would have the choice of either capitalize them or not capitalize them. For instance, Luminism and Philistinism. You do have a group of words where you have to listen to the definition to know whether or not to capitalize them. For instance, the word lobelia. If you hear the definition, it's a plant with various colored flowers, it's lowercase. But if the definition talks about the genus, it's the plant genus, it must be capitalized. The same is true with the word evangelist. If the definition were someone who enthusiastically promotes something, it's lowercase. If the definition is a writer of one of the four Gospels, it has to be capitalized. Next slide. And here we've got capitalization in the middle of a word, like in the word Dorsey. And here's our friend DeBakey. Notice it is spelled correctly there. It's got a capital D, then in the middle of the word, it's got a capital B. Please note, there is no space between the D and the Bakey. Then you've got some words with both upper and lower cases to them. Teammates, got a capital T, then a lowercase m. Van Dyke Beard, got both a capital letter and lowercase letters. So let's go to the next slide. Now, we're going to talk a bit about the importance of roots, prefixes, and suffixes. All of these pieces of words that you see on this slide have been around for generations. Tele, as you already know, means distance. Metrics clearly has to do with measurement. Phony has to do with sound. Graphy has to do with writing, and vision has to do with viewing. You take these pieces, next slide, and you create new words from old parts. Yes, these are 19th and 20th century words, but they came into being only by cobbling together pieces of words that have existed for a long time. Next slide. I want you to take a look at this little sample of roots and prefixes and suffixes. Look at them for a minute and ask yourself how many of these you know. Let's go to the next slide. Here's some more. And keep in mind, this is only a sample of roots, prefixes, and suffixes. There are a whole bunch more. One of our new words this year is belanophobia. Let's just say you needed to, that was a vocabulary word, and you needed to figure out what that word meant, but you had never seen this word before. How would you begin to figure it out? Most of you would recognize the suffix phobia. Means the word fear. So you could figure out that this is a negative word. Belanophobia literally means the fear of needles. What about another new word on our list? The word is dysphoria. Well, you might be more familiar with the word euphoria. Euphoria literally means good feeling. If you're euphoric, you're usually gleeful and happy. If you recognize the prefix dys as meaning not, it means not having a good feeling. Dysphoria then is the state of being depressed. What do you think? Another new word, filmography might mean. You could easily figure this one out, couldn't you? Graphy means writing. We know what films are. So filmography literally means a writing down of films. What about hemocytometer? Another new word. We surely know what a meter is. It's something that measures stuff. You'd recognize the prefix hema as meaning blood, so you could figure out what this word means by knowing some of its pieces. Hemocytometer is an instrument for counting red blood cells. So let's go to the next slide. This is how you cobble together a word. Odo is a prefix that means ear. Rhino means nose. Larynx means throat. An ologist is somebody who studies. You put that word together and you have a word that has often appeared on UIL test. Otorhinolaryngologist. Next word, or next slide. As you begin to become familiar, as your students rather, begin to become familiar with this word power list, especially the vocabulary words, I would have them make a list of the roots they recognize, the prefixes and the suffixes they see. That way, they can learn the pieces once and have them in their heads for things like the SAT test, as well as the vocabulary a portion of this test. Next slide. Now let's talk about some basic spelling rules that all students need to know. Let's start with, what do we do with words ending in a silent E to which we want to add a suffix to? This is typically the rule you learned in elementary school. Before attaching a suffix beginning with a vowel or a Y to a word that ends in a silent E, we typically drop the silent E. And there are going to be exceptions to that rule, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, look at how it's done. You have the word amaze. In order to attach the suffix ing to it, you drop the silent E. The same is true with nerve. If we want to turn the noun nerve into the adjective nervous, we drop the silent E and attach the suffix. Now, I would teach your students this rule. Words ending in a soft G sound, the J, or the soft C sound, which is S, this is an exception to the rule. If you were wanting to add a suffix to the word change, the last sound you hear is a soft G. If you want to add a suffix to a word ending in a soft G that ends in a silent E, you retain that silent E. Look at the word immerse. Immerse, the last sound you hear is a soft C with a silent E. To write immersement, you retain that silent E. A word that was on this last year's state test was the word clicky. Now, clicky is the adjective form of the noun clique, and a clique is a group of people with particular interest. Well, students had to figure out what to do with clicky. I would say that if they followed the rule regarding clicky, they could spell it right. It is spelled C-L-I-Q-U, drop the silent E, Y. It follows the rule. One of next year's spelling words is the word renege. Let's say I ask students to spell reneging. How would they spell it? They would apply the rule. They would drop that silent E and attach ing. The rule applies there. Let's go on to the next slide. Well, what do we do when we're attaching suffixes to a word ending in a consonant? Here's a little rule students need to know. In words of more than one syllable, double the final consonant. When the word ends in one consonant, it's preceded by one vowel, and the word is accented on the last syllable, as in these three words right here. Let's take the first one, begin. The reason it is spelled with two N's is because it follows the rule. Begin, the word begin ends in a consonant. It's preceded by one vowel. The accent is on that last syllable. So we double that consonant. Note that in the new words formed by adding suffixes, the stress stays on the same syllable. Next slide. Now, in the following examples, the accent doesn't remain on the same syllable. Therefore, the final consonant is not doubled. Like in the word refer, if we want to change that verb into the noun reference, notice the accent changes. Therefore, we do not double that final R. Same is true with conference. Same is true with preference. You do not double that last consonant. Now, let's practice with some new list words. Next slide. One of our new words this year is the word singe. If I were to ask students to write singeing, we would have to follow the rule. It ends in a soft G and a silent E. Because it's got that soft G sound, we retain that silent E. Another reason we would keep that silent E is because if we left it out, it would create an entirely different word, but that's another story. Let's go on to cauterize. Cauterize, again, ends in a silent E. To attach the suffix to it, we drop that silent E and we attach that suffix. What about deferred? If I were to ask students to write deferred, in this case, you're going to double that final consonant. Why? Because it is preceded, but that R is preceded by a vowel. The accent is on the second syllable. Therefore, we double that final R. But let's look at the word plummet. This is a new word for this year. What if I had students spell plummeting? Let's look at it. The base word is more than one syllable. It ends in one consonant. It's preceded by one vowel, but the accent is not on the final syllable. The accent is on the first syllable. Therefore, you do not double that final consonant. Next slide. When adding a prefix to a word, don't change the spelling of the base word. When a prefix creates a double letter, keep both letters. Even though it may look funny to you, keep both letters. Like in this word, if we added the prefix ear to regular, we'd have two R's right together and it would still be right. Illogical is the same way. I'd call your attention to misspell, because ironically, misspell is one of the words that's misspelled most often, and it has appeared a number of times on a UIL test. When you add the suffix ness as well as less to a word ending in an N or a L, keep both N's or L's. As in the word suddenness and thinness. They may look funny to you, but they are correct. You just glue the parts together. Let's go to the next slide. Dumbbell was a word that I put on a recent, as an outside word on a recent test. I put it on the test because it looks funny, but all I did was add a prefix to a root, glue them together, is what I used to tell my students, and you have dumbbell. It is spelled correct. Underrepresent is a new word this year, and it was also an outside word last year. It might look funny to you to see the two R's together in that word, but it follows the rule. You take the entire prefix, you attach it to the entire root, and even if it creates double letters in the middle, it's still right. Look at the word unevenness. It too might look funny to you. You do not drop one of those N's, even though you got the funny looking two consonants together. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, let's talk about our friends I before E. This has always been a problem for spellers. I before E, except when you run a feisty heist on a weird beige foreign neighbor. Let's go to the next slide. In order to tackle IE or EI. You might recall this rule we all learned in elementary school. I before E except after C or sounded long A. And it works a great deal of the time, like you see in these words: thief, relieve, grieve, niece, field. Works 100% of the time with those words, except after C. When the IE or EI has the letter C in front of it, it switches to EI, as in conceit and perceive and ceiling and receipt, or when sounded long A, as in skein, like a skein of yarn, or vain, or feint, which is a fencing move. Unfortunately, as with so many of our English rules, there are exceptions to the rules, like the word either, weird, seize, leisure. Let's practice with some of our new words this year. Next slide. One of our new words is obeisance. Obeisance. Notice that sound is a long A. Because it's a long A, the spelling is EI, and our rule applies. But we've also got Heidegger on our list this year. Heidegger is an exception to the rule. It is spelled EI, likely because it comes from German. Next slide. Let's talk about how to correctly use the suffix ibble or ubble. Here's a good little rule of thumb. If the root is not a complete word, you add the suffix ibble, like in the word visible, horrible, terrible, possible, and so forth. Those first roots are not complete words, therefore we attach ibble to it. However, if the root is a complete word, we add ubble to it. For example, fashionable, laughable, suitable, and so forth. If the root is a complete word ending in a silent E, we drop the silent E and add ubble to it, as in the word advisable, desirable, valuable, and so forth. Again, there are exceptions to this rule, like the word contemptible. Contempt is a whole word. It should have ended in able, but it doesn't. It ends in ible. Digestible is an exception to the rule. Flexible, responsibility, and so forth. I call your attention to this slide because there were 16 words using this suffix on the 3-spring test, 16 of them. A word from last year's district meet was the word fungible. Fungible is spelled Fungible. Does the rule apply to that word? Yes, it does. If you applied the rule, you would have spelled it right. Funge is not a word. It's not a complete word. Therefore, we attach ible to it. There are a great many words on this next year's list with these suffixes to them. Let's practice with this suffix. Next slide. One of our new words is malleable. Malleable. It is spelled with an A. An A goes into that blank. It is an exception to the rule because mally is not a complete word by itself. What about accessible? Accessible is spelled with an I. Another exception to the rule. It should have been an A because the word access is a complete word. Documentable is on next year's list. It is spelled with an A as the first letter of that suffix. The rule applies. Next slide. Now, let's talk about words that end in the seed sound. There are three ways to spell that suffix seed, but you need to know this rule. There is only one English word that ends in seed, and that word is supersede. And that's often found on UIL contests. I remember the first time I spotted that on our new word list years ago, I was positive it was misspelled. I was positive it should have been spelled with a C-E-D-E. I was wrong. It's the only word that is spelled with an S-E-D-E. There are only three words that end in C-E-E-D. Three words and their different forms, of course. Those words are concede, precede, exceed, proceed, and succeed. All other verbs ending in the seed sound are spelled with C-E-D-E. That is a good little tip to file away, as you see in the words precede, concede, recede, and succeed. I call your attention to the next slide. This is a new word for next year. Notice it is the noun form of the verb supersede. Pay attention to how it's spelled. That would be easy to trip up on. So call your students' attention to the correct spelling of this word. Next slide. All of these features of words in the word power list can be used to organize the words to help you learn them. You can put words into what I call word families. I strongly urge you to teach your students to do this. A great word family would be all the words that end in ibble and ubble. Another word family might be all the words that include the EIs or the IEs. More about that tomorrow. Another group of word families, next slide, are these. You might make a list of words with common or similar characteristics. You might make a list of word forms, words with non-alphabetical elements, all the words that have alternate spellings, all the words that will depend on how you capitalize them, or whether you capitalize them, I should say. Make a word family of words that have roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Next slide. One thing I do myself, especially when I'm learning all the words, and I do this typically with vocabulary, is I put all the words that fall into the category of trademarks. I put medical terms in one list. I put legal terms, typically they're going to be Latin, in one list. All the food words, all the political terms, all the music terms, all the words that might all come from German or from Spanish. I put them all in a word family. And as we talked about earlier, I'd put words with all non-alphabetical marks on them. Next slide. We've kind of mentioned these before, but students need to know how to use these non-alphabetical marks correctly. Here are some that appear often on UIL tests. The tilde, you see the circumflex, I used to call that the housetop, and the caron that looks like a V, the cedilla, that is a little comma found under a C, the diaereses, or sometimes called the umlaut, the acu, and the grave accents. Those features have to be used correctly on a spelling test, or they will be considered misspelled words. On last year's state list, I put the word gemütlich. It had to have an umlaut on it. Another word that appeared on last year's state test, I believe, was flânerie, which had to have a circumflex. You have to learn the non-alphabetical symbols. They're just as important as the letters themselves. Next slide. How are you going to teach your students to prepare for this contest? How are you going to be involved? First of all, has to be this. You have to love words. You all have to be logophiles. Again, a logophile is a word lover. And this contest has to be fun. If you are bored or you're uninterested, you can be sure your students are too. And not only that, you can be sure they will likely not be successful in this contest. To be an effective UIL coach, you have got to love words. You've got to be excited about words. If you're excited, your kids are going to be excited. It's important to emphasize the team aspect of UIL and encourage teammates to help one another. You coaches, you need to know this. If you want to create winning spellers, you've got to devote a great deal of time to this contest. Next slide. Now, I think it is important for students to create their own study materials. Now, I digress a little bit because study materials can be purchased. Flashcards can be purchased. Audio files can be purchased. But I think there's something to be said for students creating their own. One of my former state spellers created her own flashcards because she knew that writing them down, saying them out loud, and then hearing them enlisted 3 of her 5 senses. What's interesting about this particular speller is I gave her flashcards that had all of the same material on it, but she knew that in order to have this material fall into her long-term memory, she needed to write them herself. Next slide. When you have written down a word, its definition, its derivation, and pronunciation on a card, you might want to write a sentence that uses the word in its appropriate context. Do this out loud. Pronounce the word, listen to how it sounds, repeat it several times if it's a hard word. Then say the word. Spell the word out loud. Say the word again. Say the word. Write down the word. Say the word. If you practice this, it might seem kind of labor intensive to you, but it really reaps great benefits. If you were to follow this pattern, think of the 5 senses you would be using. You would be using your sense of sight because you'd be looking at the words. You would be using your sense of hearing because you're hearing the words. You are literally holding a pencil in your hand as you write the words. You are using your sense of feel. You're using 3 of your 5 senses. And if you do that, knowledge, new information will more readily fall into your long-term memory. Here's some other ways to study and prepare. One thing you can do, we've already talked about putting words into what are called practice sets. I would encourage your students to have study buddies. Maybe contestants can practice with one another, and you would need to practice at the spelling rate of 1 word every 15 seconds. Let's go on to the next slide. Another thing to do, look up new words in your reading. When I'm looking for outside words, you all, this is what I do. When I'm reading along and I come across a word that is maybe obscure to me, maybe a word I've never seen, I will look it up to see if it's in the dictionary, and it may very well find its way on a test. Audio tapes, again, are something that you can make as a teacher or you can purchase. One thing, if you have a problem with wondering how a word is pronounced, you might go to mydictionary.com to hear words pronounced. Next slide. These are fun. School hacks. Have your students eat peppermint pieces. Peppermint stimulates the brain and helps with concentration. Let's look at the next one. I certainly use this myself. When studying for a certain subject, pretend that you have to teach the material. It helps you pay more attention. Next slide. I used to use this slide when I graded research papers. Studying or grading hard for 30 to 50 minutes at a time, then rewarding yourself with a 10-minute break in between is the most effective way to study. Next slide. Love this one. Eating chocolate while studying will help the brain retain information. This next slide, I would put exclamation points behind it. Writing down something is equivalent to reading it 7 times. That's why it's important to write down spelling words. Next slide. Didn't know this one, think it's interesting. You're more likely to remember something that you write in blue ink rather than black ink. Interesting. Another thing I would have your students consider, next slide, is participating in word wars. I thought my students created this years ago. They called it word wars. And what they would literally do on their phones is throw insults at one another using vocabulary words, using spelling words. Here's an excerpt from one of their word wars. Lydia says to Kendall, "You are such a tatterdemalion. Go rusticate." Kendall responds in kind. "I hope you get the screaming memes, you varlet." Lydia responds, "You Weisenheimer, you think you're a whiz-bang wonk, but Vox Populi says you're really just a boondogging Walter Mitty." Kendall responds, "You are gauche and lack erudition. Go fall off a cuesta and catch kyphosis." Lydia responds, "Your fluorite is over. I hope you become an old femme couvert making feijoada and falafel." It's something fun for your students to do at home. Another fun activity kids could do is have a word party. Prepare words for a get-together. Some foods that you could bring to a word party would be aioli, Caesar salad, chili con carne, and eggs Benedict, and even muskmelon. On this next slide that you see, cautions for practice, beware in having your kids get a parent to call out words, because many times parents or well-meaning friends might mispronounce them. We in Texas tend to do that with lots of words, as you see in these words right here. The word different has 3 syllables, but we in Texas pronounce it with 2 syllables, like different. The same is true with the word recognize. We typically drop that G in Texas and say recognize. It's also easy for speakers to transpose letters, as in this word. I've heard this word a number of times mispronounced, irrelevant or realtor. That's why you have to get good speakers to pronounce these words. Make sure that when you do practice these words, you use the competition rate of 4 words per minute. Now, we can't have a spelling seminar without talking about the importance of handwriting. That has been an issue for a number of years. If graders can't read a word, or if they can't discern a letter, according to the Constitution, they are to isolate it from the rest of the words by adding their thumbs or pieces of paper on either side of that letter. And if it's unrecognizable, it is incorrect. Typically, we have two of the three graders must agree that the letter is correct or it's a missed word. You've got to use standard handwriting, standard printing. You can't you can't like put a slash over your I's because that's the way you dot your I. Those would all be counted wrong because a slash over a letter would be construed as an accent. Handwriting, as those of you who are listening know, has become more and more of an issue in this contest. Be sure when you are selecting your contestants, make sure that their handwriting is very legible. As I tell students and coaches many times, it doesn't matter whether you can read your handwriting. It doesn't matter whether your coach can read your handwriting. What matters is if a total stranger can read your handwriting. Next slide. At the end of every spelling contest, there is what is called a verification period. And it's a 15-minute time period where you and your contestants have an opportunity to look over your test to make sure that there were no errors made in either the grading or the computation of your paper. Make sure that you coaches, you take advantage of this. A few years ago at a state meet, we were nearly through with the contest when one coach came up to me, called my attention to the fact that there was an alternate spelling to the word ukulele. Sure enough, he was right, and we had to regrade a number of papers at that time. Don't want that to ever happen again. Next slide. Finally, this is a contest that is challenging, as it should be. If you want your students to be successful, they're going to have to practice, practice, practice. I hope that I have given you some strategies that help you today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about your questions that you have for this test. Perhaps you've got some suggestions that we could use. I'll be interested in hearing those. So please come back tomorrow, and I thank you for coming to this presentation. See you tomorrow.